Hello, it's Peter Wright and Kathleen Beauvais in Ontario, Canada, with episode number 82 of the Yakking Show. This is where we talk about life, business, and more, and we delve into a few other topics, some of which may be edgy, and today's one might push the envelope a little bit. So if you're sensitive, you're warned. But there's nothing offensive, I can assure you. And we want to bring you tips and ideas for a changing world. And as always, we have interesting guests. Today is a returning guest. He's really good, but it's Kathleen's job to introduce him. Before I hand over to Kathleen, I must say, if you enjoy our show and if you don't want to miss out on the next exciting episodes, please consider hitting the subscribe button under the screen on whichever platform you happen to be watching it on or listening it to. Enough from me for one day. So hello, Kathleen. Nice to see you back again and welcome as always. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Peter. It's great to be here as always. And thank you all so much for tuning into our show. We so appreciate you and we love reading your comments. So do please keep those coming. And if anyone out there is interested in becoming a guest on our show, please don't hesitate to reach out to Peter or myself. And if you're enjoying our shows, please don't hesitate to subscribe. And that's that button right below the video. And as Peter mentioned, we do have a special guest. In fact, he's back by popular demand. Today, he appears to be joining us from abroad, but hello, Barrett. Barrett Beaudoin is joining us today. Welcome, Barrett.
Good afternoon, Kathleen and Peter. I'm loving this beach down here in St. Barta.
So for the sake of our audience, I'll just introduce you. You are a paralegal and you work with the DC paralegals and you have such a wealth of information, Barrett. So welcome back. And I know we want to delve right into it. So perhaps just give our audience just a little bit more background about yourself and what a paralegal is.
Yeah, so paralegal is a licensed member of the Law Society, similar to a lawyer. The difference between a paralegal and a lawyer is the scope of practice. Paralegals have a reduced scope of practice in terms of their advocacy work. So we can't handle all legal matters. There's a specific range of things that we're allowed to do, but one of the things that I involve myself in particular is provincial offenses, which is the sort of avenue that we're going to be talking about today. That's my bread and butter and my second love after my wife.
Wonderful.
So, Kathleen, I think you want to ask Barrett something about the latest changes to the restrictions we're living under.
Well, that's right. I mean, gosh, this world has been changing, hasn't it? You know, Barrett, with all these new lockdowns, can you tell our audience a little bit more about what that entails? What does it mean exactly? For so many people are confused by it.
Yeah, I don't blame them. I was confused right up until 10 o'clock last night when I got my hands on the draft of the regulation to actually see what was going on here. The announcement came out around Tuesday, I think, and they were pretty vague on the details, but the sort of centerpiece of this was that the stay-at-home order, right? Mm-hmm. And that regulation finally came out around sometime last night, and you know, with all the talk that's been going on, like with curfews and that type of thing in Quebec, which is just, you know, turned into a situation all on its own. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people were really worried about what this stay-at-home order would mean for themselves and in their practical day-to-day lives. As far as I can read into it, after looking at the regulation, it seems that the idea here is just to promote more substantial compliance and sort of restrict the non-essential trips that may have been occurring more frequently before the second state of emergency was declared. And what they're trying to do, it seems, is to make sure that in any cases where an employer may be able to have an employee work from home, but perhaps just you know, wasn't willing to put the resources forward, they're trying to push them a little bit harder to get that done. there's some conversation about what an essential service is or what an essential trip is, right? And that's not defined anywhere in the law. And I think I've even mentioned some time in the past too, that really a lot of this definition in terms of essential is going to come down to court cases, right? People are going to get issued tickets and they're going to say, no, this is wrong. I shouldn't be, fined in a free and democratic country, or even put at risk of imprisonment for, going to help a friend move or something like that, right?
Well, that's the other question I was going to ask you. Is it even legal?
Well, and the question of what's legal or not, really, it's obviously one that I deal with every day. What a lot of legal representatives rely on, though, is primarily what the statute says, right? Because the statute has the ability to alter any common law rule that may have existed beforehand. The issue is that even in a situation where there is a statute created, and even if the statute itself acknowledges that it is an infringement on an individual's charter rights, the government, or the prosecution in this case, is going to be put under the onus of proof to show basically that the infringement was minimal, that it was rationally connected to the goal, and that the reason that the law was put in place was a substantial enough concern. Now, I think maybe even in one of the previous episodes, we might have briefly gone over those criteria, or what are embedded in the common law is the Oakes test, right? And that's a Section 1 analysis under the Charter, because charter rights aren't absolute. They aren't inalienable or anything like that. They are subject to a certain amount of control by the government when it's deemed appropriate, right? So a good example of this may be search and seizure, right? There's lots of common law about search and seizure, and you're talking about Section 8 charter rights at that point, right? Well, if an officer pulls you over for a routine traffic stop on a ride program, if you have some alcohol or an empty alcohol bottle sitting in open view in the front of the car, well, that gives them reasonable and probable grounds to conduct a search of the vehicle, right? Or possibly even arrest you at that point, ask you to take a breathalyzer. And I think most people would agree that if you're driving around with an empty, 2 or 3 empty bottles rolling around in the passenger seat, that yeah, that's probably something that the police should be looking into, right? But what would be unacceptable in those circumstances is if the police officer turned around and said, well, you know what? I think just because I see these bottles rolling around, or maybe there isn't that factor in this circumstance, they pull you over on a ride program and they say, well, you know what, I think you were texting while driving, so open your phone up and show me the last time you sent a text message. That would be an intrusion upon the person's privacy that I would expect be considered unacceptable in those circumstances. The same thing, they can't turn around and ask you to, open your trunk and do all this other kind of stuff either, unless they have a reason to think that, you're driving around with 24 kilos of cocaine in the trunk. And that's a pretty high bar to meet.
Right.
Yeah.
And I know Peter has a great question coming up. Peter, I just want to jump in because it'll be a segue to yours.
Sure.
So right now, under these conditions, under the lockdown conditions, if I decided, because I can go out and get some fresh air, I can go for a walk. But what if I decided to go for a drive, just to change of scenery, and I got pulled over? Can I be asked where am I going, and if I'm just saying I'm out for a drive, is that could I be charged for that?
Right, and I think that's a primary concern for a lot of people right now, right? I mean, are the police going to be setting up roadblocks at major highways? Like, are mobility rights going to be severely restricted to the point that we're almost living in a police state, and we're going to have to get letters from employers in order to go to and from work and all this stuff? I personally don't see that happening. primarily because we just don't have the resources to implement a regimen like that in order to have it sustainable. But I actually read an article earlier today that was put out in the media, and the police departments don't seem to be particularly interested in pursuing the stay-at-home order with an avenue of routine traffic stops or anything like that, because it, you know, essential is subjective, right? I was talking with some people about this before. I mean, if I was a smoker, then I need to go buy cigarettes, right? That's an essential thing that I need because I have an addiction. But, you know, obviously to a non-smoker, that trip to the corner store is not an essential service to them, right? So right there, you already have a subjective splitting. What I'm a little more interested in is the question of, let's say I'm a non-smoker, but I'm, you know, bored out of my mind because I've been locked at home, and I decide to take a walk to go to the corner store to buy a pack of cigars, even though I'm not a smoker. What's going to happen there, right? And
that's right. Yeah. So I got to. There's a really burning one I want, or two burning ones we want to ask you, but a quick one. Is this latest regulation more about window dressing and to appease the medical political bureaucrats and the small percentage of the population that are absolutely panicking, rather than to have any practical purposes?
well, and right there, I think, you know, you've kind of hit the nail on the head, Peter. There's been a lot of push against the government to create stricter measures and everything. And I think part of the problem is that in this time period, the law is being used as a political tool to increase the prospect of being reelected, right? Because
Right.
no government wants to be put in the position of being the one accused of not doing anything to address the coronavirus pandemic, right? But on the other hand, you know, they don't also want to be accused by the different end of the population as being too draconian with their measures either, right? So what the peace government right now is trying to do is keep everyone happy, but unfortunately we know that's just not
Impossible.
going.
To put it in perspective, on the world coronavirus tracking website, which I believe contains reputable information, as of yesterday morning, Canada was reported to have 843 serious or critical cases, right? 843 in 38 million. So, yeah, that's why I think it's more political than practical. Anyway, the question I really want to ask you is we've seen a number of MPPs and other senior government officials, and I heard this morning the senior executive from a London hospital all fired, losing their jobs for traveling outside the country over the Christmas period. And while it might be hypocritical if they support the government's policies, it's not illegal. So my question is, does this constitute an unfair labor practice? And have they got recourse? Because the hospital guy is already bringing a case for 4 million, I think it is, against the hospital. So what's the legal standpoint here, Barrett?
Well, I mean, this is a serious problem, right? Because on the one hand, you have these publicly paid people who are out there every day telling people not to do all these types of things, telling people that they need to make sacrifices and everything. And then on the other hand, you have those same individuals just carrying on with their lives as normal, right? The issue there, at least from a social perspective, is that it's unpalatable to people, right? They don't want to see their politicians and stuff who've been telling them for the past almost a year now to stay at home and stop the spread, and, you know, encouraging people to make all these kinds of sacrifices, especially over the Christmas holidays.
Yep.
But on the other hand, you know, you're right. They haven't actually done anything illegal. And even at the stay-at-home order, there's a special provision in there currently that allows you to be out to go to an airport or a bus station to leave out of province, right? So there's nothing illegal about this.
No.
And that's going to be a tough thing for them to beat. Now, a lot of those, especially the CEOs and that type of thing, they're going to have golden parachute clauses in their employment contracts that say, like, you know, if for whatever reason we can't continue this employment relationship, we'll pay you a bunch of money to dispense of all potential claims that might relate to employment law, right? And that's just something that they do to sort of make the transition for one CEO to another job a little bit easier. Be kind of nice if everyone was afforded those contracts, but that's an entirely different topic altogether. And I think, though, that really there is potentially a legitimate claim. Now, what's happening, though, there's a little bit of a difference in the private sector and the public sector, right? What's happening with the public sector is you have a lot of people resigning, right? And I'll put a pin in that one for a moment because there's a specific instance that I'm kind of thinking of. I think we're going to talk about that in a moment. But where someone is actually fired for breaching these policies or a company policy or something like that, but there isn't actually any like kind of corporate bylaw or any legal regulation preventing them from engaging in that behavior, it is possible that there's a wrongful dismissal claim in there somewhere.
Good. Interesting.
And
Kathleen, over to you.
You could probably address this better than I can, but I seem to think there was a Cambridge, Ontario MPP recently that had what seems to be unfair treatment because she opposed the premier. Can you speak to that, Barrett?
Yeah, so that's what's happening in the public sector with in relation to the previous question. What's just to kind of bring everyone up to speed, the Cambridge MPP, when the vote for Bill 184, which was later to become the Reopening Ontario Act, came up in the legislature, she actually voted against it. And she had some legitimate concerns that were being brought forward. But because she wasn't towing the party line, she effectively got ejected from the PC party altogether. Now she's still an elected official, but an independent, as opposed to being part of the PC party. And then, you know, so you have that situation where someone is basically, the party isn't necessarily the employer, but for the purposes of our discussion here, it's a good corollary, right? So you have this employer that basically says, look, you're fired for not conforming to what our vision of this thing is, right? Which to me is completely outrageous, because the whole purpose of publicly elected officials is that they're able to vote their conscience on any particular bill that passes through Parliament, regardless of whether or not it's the official party line or not, right? They work for the constituents.
Right.
So that situation actually infuriated me, and I was a little upset that we weren't talking about it more, because there's actually some underlying issues in there. I mean, you can take that issue and branch out into, you know, how female politicians even more generally are treated as opposed to their male counterparts in politics, right? I know there was a little bit of discussion about that in the news before the pandemic overtook the news cycle. Then on the other hand, you know, you have someone like Rod Phillips, who holds a high position in the cabinet, held a high position in the cabinet, and it, you know, comes back from this trip and is more or less kind of, you know, given a finger wag and then told, you got two options. I mean, it's untenable that we keep you on in this high profile cabinet position now. So, you know, I can either fire you or you can quit. Yeah. And yet he's still a member of the party. So my question there is, you know, where's the equitable treatment? Right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
Time is marching on. Kathleen's got a burning one for you. Got some interference somewhere.
A little bit of interference, but hopefully it doesn't bother the audio too much. Yes, I have another question for you, Barrett. I know that getting back to the police force, they must be in a very difficult position right now. And I know that, you know, I have a lot of respect for our police force. Lord knows we need them. But there are several officers that have launched a court case against the government. And, you know, they're confused too. I'm sure they are, because they're getting a lot of pushback from a lot of citizens saying that they're not upholding their constitutional rights. Can you address that?
Yeah, and you know, this it's a very complicated issue, and I would actually commend those officers for bringing that to light. I think that most officers, they really, when they get into the profession, they do have a deeply ingrained belief in the fact that we are a free and democratic country. And they're really more concerned with taking care of behaviors that would be considered criminal, right? Part of the issue with a lot of these regulations and stuff that are coming out and will be prosecuted under the Provincial Offences Act in the Ontario Court of Justice is that they're not criminal behaviors, right? There are some degrees of liability and stuff, but the actual harm that's being created on an individual to individual basis, especially if that person is proven later on at no time to have even been infected or passing the infection around. I mean, it does seem on its face completely unjust. And, you know, I think the other issue is too, in terms of enforcement and what the police officers are having problems with, is that you have people who have these opinions about how things should be. And, you know, the officers are the ones on the front lines, right? They have to deal and interact with the public all the time. And every once in a while, you get these volatile individuals who, you know, maybe not necessarily put the officers at risk, but nobody wants to have somebody standing there in their face screaming at them about their rights and stuff like that. And to be perfectly honest, a lot of those people don't fully understand their own rights either, right? This goes back to a misunderstanding of what the charter really means and how it's applied in certain situations. So absolutely, those officers are being put in a really tough position, and I can absolutely see the point of view that they would feel that they shouldn't really be responsible for managing these types of situations on the enforcement end, because it's not criminal behavior, and it's not really what they signed up for when they joined the police force, right? Of course, on the other hand, you also then have the other set of police officers who say, look, the job is the job, and we're here to do the job, and, you know, we don't ask questions about it, right? So, and that's an interesting aspect to this, right? What you'll come to find is when you look at sort of the beliefs within the population, and then, you know, you look at the beliefs within the police forces themselves, you will probably start to find that there is a good representation in terms of political beliefs as a subset within the police force themselves, right? So because those police officers are launching that court action, what you're seeing is actually a recognition among a larger subset of people who have authority to speak on that particular matter, bringing these issues forward. And they absolutely should, because my personal opinion is that the law should not be used in this way, right? This wasn't really the intention. And, you know, you can consider it maybe a little bit more of a libertarian type of point of view. Not that I ascribe to that particular political philosophy at all, really, but I do have, you know, probably a little bit more of a conservative leaning when it comes to that, in the sense that I don't think the government should be governing the aspects of everyone's life. I don't think the government should have absolute say over, you know, how a business runs its business, save for obvious things that are wrong, like fraud or misrepresentation, or, you know, causing some kind of harm to the public, right? So that's kind of where I am on that spectrum. And, you know, I think that I'm pretty close to where those officers are, saying that, no, this is a little bit of an overstep and this is not really what we signed up for.
Absolutely. I'm watching our time. I don't know what's going on with that sound, but let's battle through. I read on a website, and unfortunately I went back to try and find it, and I cannot for the life of me find it, but it's something that's been going through my mind since we spoke before, in fact, for weeks, and that I believe some of the world leaders, I won't name names, but many of the world leaders, by imposing these restrictions for a disease that is in most countries no worse than a bad flu season, are actually guilty of crimes against humanity. So I read a report the other day that said a leader of a major European country is having a case against him brought in the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Now, I wish I could find the specific reference, and I will find it, but I can't find it at the moment, because the lockdowns are causing so many deaths, harm, misery, starvation, way in excess of what the disease itself is causing. And they point to cases like Sweden, most African countries, and the state of Florida, where there's virtually no lockdowns, and the death rate per 100,000 is lower than in most of the other countries and states where there are lockdowns. So has that case got merit?
I can see potentially where, when you're looking at crimes against humanity and this kind of stuff, a lot of times those issues are tied to protected human rights ground. So just the fact that, you know, there is a large set of the population, a possible defense to that is that it wasn't targeting a particular ethnic group or anything. So it wasn't like a form of genocide or anything like that, right? That's a pretty, I guess it's a bit of a loaded question. The fact that the case got into the courts in the first place and is being reviewed indicates that there is some merit to looking at those issues, right? Whether or not it's going to result in an outcome, but there's an interesting kind of aspect of that, even beyond like the discussion of protected grounds and whether or not there's merit to the case, and it's dealing in human rights. And this sort of goes back to the you know, the politicians all off jet setting and this kind of thing, is just how differently these rules and everything are affecting people across the socioeconomic spectrum, right? Because, you know, you have a certain percentage of the population who says, you know what, it's Canada, we're in lockdown, it's cold here, I'm miserable, you know, I've been working all year, I'm just gonna go buy a plane ticket and go off somewhere and get away from it for a little while, right? And then you have the majority of the population who just, that's not a feasible option to them, right? And Absolutely. So, and then you're talking too about issues like starvation and mental health and everything. And it's a pretty well studied fact that, you know, mental health tends to be lower in people of lower socioeconomic class. They experience more negative health outcomes when they experience critical illness and this type of thing. And I would actually say that I think it might be time that we really take a step back and look at our human rights legislations and start to think about how socioeconomic class needs to be put in there as a protected ground. Because, you know, there's lots of people talking about how internet should be a human right and, you know, housing should be a human right. Now, it technically is. And I think that when people say those types of things, they may not fully understand what a human right is, right? It's not that you get something, it's that you are not allowed to experience discrimination based on a protected ground, right? So, but at the same time, I think that if we were to include socioeconomic status as a protected ground, it might provoke people to start looking at things in a way, and especially policymakers, to start looking for ways to ensure that society is more equitable, which is actually what the law is supposed to be meant for.
That's right. Yeah, we're out of time, Barrett. So how can people contact you?
My number is 647-525-6829. And my email address is barrett.beaudoin@gmail.com.
Excellent. Well, we could go on and on for hours. There's so many facets of this whole situation we're in right now that leads to endless discussion and unfortunately huge hostility and divisiveness or division amongst the. Wow, I've never experienced it as much as I'm seeing now before, and it's so sad. I've just been watching a documentary on Britain it's called The Wartime Farmer, and how the whole country virtually pulled together and the conditions they worked under to feed the nation, and I compare it to the attitudes now of people snitching on neighbors, and I think, wow, what have we come to? Anyway, enough babbling from me. Over to Kathleen. Thanks from me, Barrett.
Yes, thank you so much, Barrett, for joining us, and we hope to have you again on the show because it's our audience, by popular demand, we had you back, so we'll have you back again soon, we hope. So thank you, and thank you all so very much for tuning into our show. We so appreciate you, and if anyone out there is interested in becoming a guest on our show, please don't hesitate to reach out to either Peter or myself. So until next time, do take care. Bye-bye.